Well, this one's going to be a bit of a doozy. I almost don't know where to begin. Well, I guess I should begin by clarifying a few things. Despite what many people accuse me of, any form of racism is unacceptable, regardless of who it is directed at. Moreover, reverse racism is still racism, plain and simple. You can't apply a set of standards to just some groups. It must apply to all groups. One thing I want to make clear, to argue that extreme racism in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s wasn't a thing merely demonstrates that you are incredibly ignorant. Nobody wants to diminish what African Americans went through prior to the Civil Rights era. Nobody wants to diminish the importance of historical figures like Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. These are both important historical figures, and rightfully so. This episode review isn't meant to argue the facts of this historical event. Rather, the focus is on how the event was portrayed in this episode of Doctor Who. It is replacing one form of bigotry with another form of bigotry. In the 1950s, pendulum was pretty much stuck to one side, but now in 2018, the pendulum has swung and gotten stuck on the other side. Since Chris Chibnall gave himself a co-writing credit on this episode, I'm assuming to feed his ego, my comments will be directed more at him than Marjorie Blackman, as I'm pretty sure most of this episode's heavy-handedness was his idea. He set the course for this disaster of a season. And frankly, the guy's a complete hack. Remember Thin Ice from the travesty that was Peter Capaldi's final season? You know, the one where a very poor episode was thrown together just so the Doctor could go back in time to punch a racist? Well, this episode's kind of like that, only on steroids. This might be the most egregious example of extreme virtue signaling we've ever seen. The two whitest dudes on the face of the earth are here to lecture us about racism. From their point of view, I'm pretty sure they've decided that 99.9% of straight white men are the scum of the earth. But they and their elitist upper-class friends are different. They are superior to us normal folk, and they need to focus on telling us that we're scum. Let's dig a little bit deeper into this. I think Chris Chibnall might make for an interesting psychological case study. When you look at his writing, both within the world of Doctor Who and outside the show, it seems pretty clear that Chibnall really doesn't like men, especially white men. He also seems like someone who didn't want for much when he was growing up, or to use an NPC term, it seems pretty clear that he had some privilege. I also think that, at school anyway, he may have been bullied mercilessly. And I think because of this, he has harbored a deep resentment towards other men. Maybe girls didn't want to go out with him and decided to go for more manly men. Maybe he tried the whole male feminist thing, thinking it would work. He eventually got married, and now wants to make sure he doesn't step out of line. Regardless, there seems to be some resentment here. I think this is why he insisted on changing the gender of the Doctor, for no logical reason. It wasn't for narrative purposes, it was to prove a point. I'm fairly certain that much of the vitriol that we see in Rosa comes directly from him, and most, but not all of the vitriol, comes from white males. Now back to this pile of ass of an episode. Again, I'm not arguing against historical events. I'm criticizing how they were depicted. Before we get to the most significant problem with this episode, let's look at some of the other issues. A ridiculously contrived plot finds the Doctor and her friends one day before Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. The TARDIS detects Artron energy and blah blah blah. Sorry, but F for effort when it comes to story development. Then we have ex-prisoner Krasko, or whatever the hell his name is. He's in this timeline for a mysterious reason. Gee, I wonder what that is. More on this later. So, that's the very weak backdrop to this story. Even some of the things I actually liked in the last two episodes seem to fail in this one. The visual look was significantly weaker. Frankly, I thought it looked cheap, and almost like one of those syndicated budget science fiction shows from the 90s. There's another major problem. The acting in this episode, almost across the board, is terrible, especially from the guest stars, most notably the ones playing Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King. Parks comes off as unconvincing, and frankly, just unpleasant most of the time, which kind of tramples on the legacy of the real Rosa Parks. I don't know exactly what the guy playing King was doing, but nothing about this screamed, "This is Martin Luther King." The 13th Doctor was over the top and annoying, as she has been in every episode so far, but somehow she just seems so much worse in this episode. The accent also seemed to be much more annoying, and the way she says Ryan is beyond irritating. Again, you could see Whittaker trying so hard to act that it was actually painful to watch. Walsh and Cole were okay, but they were given some of the most cringeworthy material in the history of the franchise. I don't place the blame for this on them, but we'll touch on that in a minute. Mandeep Gill's character, again, seemed completely pointless, and the rest of the supporting cast was quite over the top, for reasons we are just about to get into. Now the big question. While this episode has many problems, which problem was the most serious? Which problem might result in losing a significant proportion of the Doctor Who fanbase forever. Well, you may remember that at the top of this review I said racism in any form is completely unacceptable. Well, let's take a look at the way white people, minus Graham, are handled in this episode. It's quite the understatement to say that there's some racist strawmanning going on here. Believe it or not, Doctor Who production team, not all white people in the southern US were violent and profane racists during this time period. Many actually spoke out against the treatment of African Americans. Well, yes, this may have been centered in the northern states. This was also a thing in the south. For balance, why aren't any of them included in this episode? Why is every white person in this episode portrayed as the Antichrist? If you look at aspects of this episode as a comedy, it almost makes sense. Every white person in this episode is a complete douchebag. Let's take a look at this in order. 1 minute into the episode, we get introduced to the bus driver in 1943. Douchebag. Then, about 4 minutes in, we're introduced to douchebag number 2. And I'm not making this up, he literally punches Ryan in the head after he tries to return his wife's handkerchief. I mean, what the hell, Chibnall? Then we get introduced to future Artron Energy Guy, and he's a complete douchebag, but more on him later. We then get introduced to the next douchebag at the diner. We'll call this one Equal Opportunity Douchebag. And this one even drops a very bad word and then proceeds to kick them out. Subtlety, thy name is Chibnall. Next, we get introduced to Officer Douchebag. He comes off as delightful. By the way, that's sarcasm, NPCs. I need to clarify this because you people don't believe in humor. I mean, who needs Law and Order, right? I just love the fact that we were introduced to him with a foreboding shadow. He uses a not very nice word too. Several, actually. A bit later, we get to meet future douchebag again, and Whitaker gets to neuter him, and he tells us that this point in history is, quote, where things start to go wrong. Ooh, I wonder where this is going. It's a mystery. Then, near the end of the episode, we get introduced to old douchebags, or I guess we could call them retired douchebags. I think, at least for the upper-class Brits that were responsible for this episode, it must feel great to pick on Trump-supporting Southern Americans. Of course, we are talking about a time when Trump was a kid, but Southern Americans seem to be a favorite target for NPCs. NPCs have this really annoying sense of superiority, and they view what I guess they call Trumpland as something that is unworthy of licking the crap off their boots. Well, now they have an entire episode that shits on these people. I'm also pretty sure they are convinced that the Southern United States hasn't changed one bit since the 1950s. Of course, there are still issues, but not every white person living in the region is a racist bigot, you morons. We also have some modern day SJW stuff, or NPC stuff, going on in this episode. We have Ryan talking about how evil the cops are, because, you know, all cops are scum of the earth. But one thing I'd like to point out is Yasmin talking about being harassed. I know this is just a fictional character, but what form does this harassment take? Because, as far as I know, most public sector jobs have harassment policies that are so draconian that your career can be ended just by looking at someone the wrong way. Here, she refers to harassment she receives when going out on calls. Reality check, Yaz. Being a police officer is hard, and criminals are not going to take your feels into account. They are bad people. Let's also not forget that there are some organizations out there that actually want white police officers killed. This might be a bit more serious than being called bad names. Why not look at this perspective for some balance? Oh, never mind. That would remove your victim card. How silly of me. Also, Yaz, just to be brutally honest, you actually had an extremely unfair advantage when getting this job. Not only did you get to check one special box, you got to check two. I'm pretty sure this is how the actress that portrays your pointless character got the gig. Perhaps you weren't actually suitable for this job, and that's why you get bent out of shape when criminals are mean to you. Now, let's talk about the dude from the future. We already know he's a douchebag, but spoilers, what is his entire motivation? Racism. Yep. This is one of the most in-your-face things I've ever seen in Doctor Who. This is also, perhaps, the most one-dimensional villain. There is no character development here, no backstory, other than the fact that he's been to prison. He tells Ryan he's doing this so, quote, your kind won't get above themselves. He's just some evil, racist white dude from the future. Wow, just wow, Chibnall. Please look up the definition of the words subtlety and nuance. This plot point was so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud when I heard it. Set aside the agenda-driven crap in this episode. As a story writer, you're terrible. I'm not letting you completely off the hook either, Marjorie Blackman. Maybe you should stick to writing children's books. Actually, that's what this episode was. A children's book. A children's book designed to brainwash kids into thinking that all white people are the scum of the earth. Keep in mind that a lot of kids watch this show, which, I don't know about you, but I find this to be pretty concerning. If this episode depicted any group other than white people, or mainly white men, that is to say, it would have been accused of committing a hate crime. Now let's talk about the fandom. The NPCs are falling all over themselves to praise this episode. Not because it was good, because it wasn't, but because they think it makes them look good. I've seen a lot of blatant virtue signaling in what's left of the Doctor Who fan community since the casting announcement was made last year, but this is nothing compared to what I've seen in the past week. If you disagree with any part of this episode, then you're pretty much to be excommunicated from fandom. There's a certain little forum I used to follow. I suggest you take a look. It's quite amusing. And what the hell was with that song? Jesus Christ, Chibnall. I know you think you're trying to be deep here, but this just comes off as ridiculously tacky. It's as if you're saying, look at me. Look at what I did here. Aren't I special? Aren't I awesome? Everyone worship me, because I'm better than all of you. Worship me while this song plays in the background. Also, down with white people. Well, mainly white men. But then I did have that woman, so... For this episode, down with white people. Wow, Chibnall, this episode was one of the most in-your-face things I've seen in a very long time. I said it before and I'll say it again. Nobody's arguing that racism wasn't a thing in Montgomery, Alabama. We all know this. But there are many different ways you could have gone about telling this story. But no, you just took established facts and pretty much developed a piece of hate propaganda targeting white people. Well, every white person except you and your elitist friends. But this is Chris Chibnall, so it's really white men. We can't forget intersectional feminism. Well, except for the diner woman. I'm sure she had internalized misogyny too. You replaced one form of racism with another. I'm going to point something out, Chibnall. As much as you would like to claim otherwise, white males are the reason why Doctor Who has existed for as long as it has. Am I saying that white males are the only fans that matter? Of course not. There are fans from all races and both genders, and I'm very happy that they are fans and that they've enjoyed the show for all these years. But Chibnall, you can't outwardly attack your primary fan base and think it's going to end well. But then again, you don't care. The BBC doesn't care. You have a very clear agenda, and ultimately you have the license fee to shield you from consequences. The ratings have been falling since the first episode, and I think they're going to continue to fall. The overnights for this episode were 6.39 million, down from 8.2 million only 2 weeks ago. That's 1.81 million people who decided that, at least when the episode was shown live, that they had better things to do. So tune in next week for another pointless episode. This time about spiders. Oh goody, and look who wrote this one. I don't know who this guy is, but I'm pretty sure he's a douchebag, and I'm sure the spider will be a racist misogynist too. This is the first time I'm going to support #cancel Doctor Who. Please, for the love of God, put this show out of its misery before it's too late. If it's not too late already. And that's it for today. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, and check out my other channel, Bulls Trek Media, for Blu-ray and technology videos. And as always, everyone, thank you for watching, and have a great day.